Hello, and welcome to this video on the new Systems Instruments Discrete Map and its expander, a sequencer addressed by voltage rather than a clock, a free-time moving map of voltages. I found lots of interesting results with this one, and here's what's to come. This video is sponsored by New Systems Instruments. To get us into this design, I'm going to quote the press release for Discrete Map as it does a great job of highlighting what this is and where it comes from. Skip ahead to the time on screen if you want to go straight to a feature and panel rundown, or straight to the patches. Discrete Map reimagines sequencing as the creation of events in continuous time, tightly integrated with the other signals in your modular system. Instead of a conventional pulse clock, Discrete Map responds to any smoothly varying signal, including the internal ramp clock, to precisely place these events anywhere in time. Discrete Map is designed to interface with modular time, where rhythms are often created organically from beat frequencies, stacked LFOs, interacting envelopes, etc. Taking inspiration from the Hegelian philosophy, Discrete Map introduces dialectical sequencing. While conventional sequencers are based on a hierarchical model where the idea determines the performance, dialectical sequencing imagines the sequencer as a tool for placing compositional elements between interacting signals. Operating on discrete logic and analog switches, Discrete Map responds in microseconds, and it doesn't alias. With over 800 components, Discrete Map might be the most complex Eurorack module ever created, at least according to this metric, which New Systems acknowledge is probably meaningless. So looking at the Discrete Map, there's clearly influence from the Buchla MARF, but as the manual mentions, there's sort of indirect influence from Serge systems too, where sequencing is often achieved through chains of multiple non-sequencer modules. So with all that said, let's get into the features. Discrete Map, by default, controls its time with an inbuilt ramp wave generator. With the switch set to slow, you have a rate control, volt per octave, and CV over rate with attenuator that controls the timing of this ramp moving through the map of voltages. Setting this switch to be fast turns this into audio rates, and it opens up all this glorious audio creation. You can also sync or reset, like a hard sync on an oscillator, the internal ramp, or you can do that with the sync N input, where this port allows you to set a 1 to 16 division to sync every nth every number of times it receives a sync input on that socket. We have an EOC, end of cycle output, to chain events from the end of the discrete map sequence, and there's a once or loop switch. Setting this to loop will cycle indefinitely, or setting it to once will fire off a one-shot cycle through these 8 stages, and that happens through triggering the sync inputs. This internal ramp wave has its own output, and that's normalized to the X input, which is the input for the signal to drive through the map of voltages. Moving on to the bottom half of the module here, these 8 sliders control the time that each step occupies. In the position mode, on this switch, you can think of it as setting direction-specific comparator thresholds, and in length mode, each slider sets the relative length of time each step occupies. So with its linear ramp controlling through this movement, you can control how long each step lasts. This row of switches changes when the steps are addressed, whether that's from a rising voltage or a falling voltage, or you can actually just turn steps off in the middle of that three-way switch position. There is an X input, which by default is normal to the internal ramp, but patching in here takes over and lets you address and scan through this map with external signals, be them LFOs, envelopes, or audio signals. The top set of sliders control the voltages that are then present at the FX output here, and the sliders create voltages set by this range switch going from -5 to +5 volts, 0 to 5 volts, or just 0 to 2.5 volts. We also have a gate output, and the length of that gate is controlled on this gate length pot. We have a +Y input, which is a transpositional input, so you can mix in external signals here to transpose these voltages, or you could think of it as adding in modulation or even audio to the voltages that these steps create. The EXT, or external input, overrides the activity and cancels the current stage, so no stage is selected, and this results in a 0-volt output. We then have above and below inputs, and sending in a voltage to above sets the uppermost value of the sliders, and sending a voltage into the below input sets the lowermost value of these sliders. Alongside the discrete map, we have the ABC expander, and this allows for grouping each of these 8 stages into A, B, and C sets. And that's set on these 8 switches, they're freeways, selecting A, B, or C per stage. You can then modulate the threshold of these groups and attenuate your modulation. We have 3 gate outputs here, A, B, and C, and that routes the gate that is always firing per stage change or step change to A, B, and C as set on these switches. And finally, we have a bidirectional switch that has a common input or output that routes to 3 inputs or outputs. So you could send in any input here, audio or modulation or clocks even, and by these stages selecting, route them to the ABC outputs, or you could put 3 inputs into A, B, and C and have them be switched between and come out of the common output. Before I get into my first patch, I have some clips from Anton of the musical duo Nireus. He's worked with New Systems Instruments on testing and shared a great musical trill-like sequence patch and has then performed with that. It's nice to share music and what others are doing, so let's take a listen to that before we move on. There's lots of patches to come, those are linked in the timing index below, going through exploring the features and sequencing to more advanced functions, through to all the fun and great sounding audio applications. So do skip around as you like, and let's dive in. So let's start with the Discrete Map as a kind of melodic playground, kind of basic sequencer, as much as it can be a basic sequencer if you like. We're listening to the harmonic shift oscillator through a passive low-pass gate. The gate output here, or a copy of it on the expander as far as this is set, is striking the low-pass gate, have some stepped random modulation unrelated here to some of the harmonic controls, and it's this top row coming out blue cables and trace, and then into a quantiser just off screen that's controlling the pitch of the oscillator. The ramp out, green cables and trace on data there, is the internal ramp that we can see clocking through or voltage addressing the position. The switch is set to posit rather than length. While I was saying that to length's quite an interesting shift, we'll stick to it addressing the position of this map of voltages. And with all these switches set to rise, as it's a rising ramp, we're rising through in a steadier, clean kind of order that I can get through a rising set of voltages. Now if I start to move any of these, let's say I swap kind of positions of step 2 and 4, we have a very different sequence very quickly. And of course if I start doing this with say some of the other steps, start to get some interesting step motion and timings coming through what we can think of as like preset pitches, just going up a scale here. We could go the other way, where we go kind of down in a ramp-like fashion. We could go completely kind of random here, and as some of these are really close, we kind of flam and go really quick past them. Really interesting for kind of custom timings there. Let's patch into the X input. Let's take a triangle LFO and drive this from a source that's going up and down in motion, and not just up all the time like a rising ramp. You can see the triangle now on data, still the green trace and green cables, and you can see the activity there on those LEDs. And this leads to these switches, which are all set to rise, so it rises through these positions as the triangle goes up, and as none of them are set to fall, as this comes back down again, none of them are addressed on that kind of falling side of the triangle. Now we could say set all the even steps to be fall. Which is quite interesting. You could set the first 4 to rise, last 4 to fall. So even with the same position set, what this is doing, the triangle and the rise and fall switches, we can completely readdress the positions within this map of voltages. Now before I move on, I was just experimenting, and the Discrete Map really does kind of warrant and invite experimentation. This is the exact same patch, other than I'm driving the Discrete Map from a spare output here on the harmonic oscillator. The top row is being quantized and pitch controlling the oscillator, so we now have a feedback loop of controlling this with the oscillator that this is controlling. It's still going through some effects and low pass gates, but we go from kind of thunderous low, almost like red noise rumbles, for a whole series of kind of bonkers effects. I'm playing with the harmonics here, so this isn't just a simple sine wave. kind of locks into these weird, almost like Benjamin-esque, kind of like fighting and stalling interactive rhythmic states. Just trying to find one of these kind of like interlocking I mean, what the hell's that? I mean, you've got to be into some pretty abstract noise to be into such things, but I really find those interlocking, kind of like weirdly syncing and then dissipating again and coming back, noisy interactions really fascinating. Okay, enough of that for now. So here's a patch that I'm really enjoying where I've set the bottom controls here to be length. So these control the length of the overall sequence, kind of relative to the other steps. And it's led to a really interesting rhythm, and one that feels quite steady and regular. But it's really achieved in an interesting way. Now this is directly sequencing the harmonic shift oscillator again. I do have a Y input here, which will transpose alongside this sequence, and that's coming down into a quantiser and giving me this transposing pitch sequence. Now my transposition sequence, which is the red trace here on data, also controls another oscillator to give us a baseline. And I'm going to mess up this timing in a moment, but I just kind of want to hold on to it for a second as we take a look at the expander. Now these outputs on the expander, A, B and C, are gate outputs, and that selects each stage to route to A, B or C. So if these are all routed to A here, these are going out to trigger my kick drum. On B, or let's go to C rather as a base state. C is a hi-hat, B is a snare. So I can switch where the gates route to three outputs here for kick, snare and hi-hat rhythms. So with everything playing, let's get the bass back in and the main transposing sequence. And again, that's the transposition sequence that's playing the bass into the Y input. So this slower voltage adds to this one before being quantized for my main lead voice. Effects back in. Let's just set this neutral with the length controls all in the middle and just try and get like a really steady, as if it's clocked type pattern. Now with everything playing, let's play around with the timing just so you can see how this affects this length control. We could try and do like a kind of swing thing where 1, 3, 5 and 7 last longer than 2, 4, 6 and 8. And again, this is controlling the overall length that this step is assigned relative to just this ramp coming up as the overall length of each kind of cycle of the sequence. So as we've just been exploring the length mode here rather than the position mode, and we just had some drums from the expander, I thought we'd explore the length as a kind of timing mechanism with some drums just in isolation. With all these set in the middle, we can see the ramp, and I'm using the switches here on the expander to route the gate to the A, B and C outputs. A is a kick drum, B is a snare, and C is a hi-hat. Now just with this basic beat as it is, let's start moving these sliders around and changing the relative length of time or kind of amount of voltage in this ramp, if you like, that each stage takes. And if we lowered the even steps, we'd get into some swing, as we did in the previous patch. Where our odd numbered steps are lasting slightly longer than the even numbered steps. But with this kind of control set, we're not limited to just kind of having a swing. You can do much more creative things here. So let's just play around, seeing where we end up, just nudging things. So we now have this kind of wonky rhythm. So with the ability to address this via external CV rather than the internal ramp, I thought we could play around with the idea of wavefolding time. Which is an odd kind of Doctor Who-esque time travelling thing to kind of say out loud. But here I'm using a sine wave that's going through a wave folder. It's the green trace there, the red is the sine that's been folded. And that's the timing mechanism for addressing these steps. This controls the pitch, and the actual oscillator that we're listening to, that's going through a low-pass gate, is the ramp that's included on the discrete map. So this is my audio oscillator. It's not timing anything here because I'm using the folded sine, and I'm sending this through a quantiser to send it some quantized pitch. Now, these are all being addressed on the rising side of this wave, so we have that moment of silence as the sine comes back down. Let's say assign even numbers. Even numbers to the falling portion here. So as the sine comes back down, we go up the odd numbers and down the even. Now if I start folding this sine wave that's controlling the timing or movement through our map, it's the folding that's kind of scanning through this in this kind of stop-start walking, kind of kangaroo driving style. Let's slow the whole thing down. So here I'm using the discrete map as a kind of quantiser or harmoniser. And I'll break it down in a moment, I'll play around first. I think it's a really lovely sounding example and really fascinating way to work with transposing and addressing, kind of harmonising on a voltage and sequencer stage. So removing my effects and centering one of the sounds here in the mix. And at the core of the patch is an arpeggiator playing from this keyboard. And that volt per octave comes into a mult here and is controlling an oscillator, the left hand one which is the triangle wave going into a low pass gate, pan centering the mix, nothing to do with the discrete map at this point. And if I mute that, this is that volt per octave signal coming in to transpose the discrete map. Let's remove that for a second. But it's also the driving voltage as opposed to the internal ramp. So it's actually coming in with the position mode here for the bottom sliders. And you can think of these as kind of comparator thresholds. So it addresses these steps depending on what this incoming voltage is. And by itself, this comes out into an actual pitch quantiser. And I'm also using this signal to transpose, but even without it, if I just pan these voices, I think that's really interesting, even just by itself. But muting the kind of main background layer, if you like, and just using the discrete map, I can also use the arpeggio to transpose by adding it to the Y input, as well as to drive the changes. So here this is now by itself. I have my keyboard arpeggio and these voltages being added together and then being quantized. And they control the volt per octave on another oscillator going to another low pass gate. And again, it's a triangle wave. So if I pan this hard right, and I pan the other voice not using the discrete map hard left, we have a really interesting kind of harmonization done at the pitch level, transposed voltage level, if you like, as opposed to kind of audio harmonization. And I think this works really well. And as you can imagine, something so rich and musical, I've been playing this for ages. I should really stop and make the rest of the video. So you may be wondering with the discrete map how you can reset it, and quite simply, that's what the sync input is for. Well, the sync input, if you want to reset like a hard sync on an oscillator, the ramp wave that drives it by default. If you're plugging in an external X input here, you can just use whatever voltages you want to address as many steps as you want with whatever wave shape you want to put in to drive your wave through the map, or through the steps. Here I'm going to use the expander, and if I patch out of C, just the blue cable and trace here, into the sync, if I say set step 3 to C, we can see that's resetting. We could do any of them. And you can see that effect that has on the ramp. What's quite interesting is if we use the sync N, where we can sync on a division, you can go for longer patterns where you go through all 8 stages and say just a couple more and then reset. So it makes it feel like a longer pattern than just the 8 stages and just resetting at a number lower than 8. So let's add some division here, and we'll go from step 3. You can see we go all the way through and then get to 3 and go back, and you can see that in the ramp wave on the yellow trace there. Let's do another step and add a bit more division here. So with the expander, you can use that in the sync to reset without needing to drive it from another external voltage. So here's the discrete map. There's a one-shot. There it goes. There's a one-shot animation generator. It's in one-shot mode rather than loop mode, and it's being triggered every few bars. This triggers a little pitch flurry, some modulation, and some more modulation. Now muting the drums, this is controlling the bass here, which is just playing a slower kind of root note sequence, and the main out is controlling a little pitch flurry. Interesting shift in timing here with different lengths of relative time. Here it comes again. But I'm I'm also taking the gate out, blue tracing cables here, which triggers an envelope to modulate my filter. I'm taking the ramp out, because this is like a bipolar one-shot ramp, to fire some sound into my delay. So if I mute this, let's just wait for that to come back around. Here it comes. That ramp stays at its high voltage, and when it comes round, it goes back all the way down, ramps back up, and holds at that high voltage. So I've actually inverted it in a utility outside of Discrete Map. So it becomes like a falling ramp in a VCA, firing some sound into my effects. Now the other bit of modulation comes from the EOC, the end of cycle, and this fires off an envelope. It's the yellow trace here. And what's that doing is shifting my filter to a high pass. So listen to the low end. With that wow kind of little swell into a high pass tone. It also increases the resonance on the filter. So this triggers from my over sequencer every few bars, with this kind of odd time kind of glitch of pitch change happening. I'm using the ramp to fire the sound into the delays, and the end of output, and the end of cycle to fire off an envelope to modulate my filter. And it's an interesting and can be quite complex kind of one-shot event animation generator, if you like. And I like this kind of odd glitchy time here. You could drive this from something in time with your sequence. You could drive it with something that's in time and stepping with, say, your tempo-based kind of digital sequencer, if you like, and have that more in time. But not everything needs to be on the grid, and I like the glitchiness. So this is the Discrete Map as a graphic complex envelope. I'm using one-shot mode, and I'm using the sync input to trigger it from a gate on my keyboard. That's the green trace here and the green cable. And then I'm playing oscillators into a filter, but the output here, so a one-shot ramp internally cycles or steps through this, if you like. The output, which is the blue trace, the stepped sequence, then goes through inertia as a slew, so I can curve this stepped one-shot sequence into an envelope. Now slew time, and of course the timing, I'm in length mode here, is all going to have an effect. I'm also passing my volt per octave to the slew, and I'm also passing it to the volt per octave of the internal rate. If I remove that, I'll play a low note, then a high note. Now doing that with the volt per octave in, that higher note, and I'll play the same two notes again, should move through much faster. And it's quite interesting having envelope time tied to pitch. I'll just lower the slew here. I'm going to remove that hi-hat that I'll come to in a second from the expander. Let's just change the shape up here. Bit of a faster slew. And I could play with this endlessly, creating these custom envelope shapes. But I'm using the expander here. I was going to use the end of cycle output just to trigger a hi-hat, just to kind of show how that works. And of course it does work. If I play a note again, it gets to the end of the cycle and this triggers a hi-hat sound. But if I keep playing notes much faster, this is re-triggering before it's actually got to the end of the cycle. So using the expander here, I've patched to the C gate output and step 8's switch. I'm switching across to. If I play faster notes now, while this re-triggers, I don't get the hi-hats until I get to the end. So here I was playing around with this unique kind of folded and reshaped waveform as the driving mechanism for the discrete map. It's the harmonic shift oscillator here. I'm also modulating the harmonics with the same signal that's driving the sequence. The sequencer's output here on the blue cables, blue trace there on the scope, is then being quantized, and that's the pitch information. And as I keep doing with a discrete map, I keep kind of stumbling into these uniquely timed but really musical kind of little gestures. But what I wanted to explore here is, because I'm not using the ramp oscillator, I was just self-patching it back to influence the sequence. Say the external in here, that when it receives a gate or a high voltage, it cancels that step. So let's give that a go. And you can see actually turning LEDs off, and the voltage just drops down to 0, a bit faster. It's really interfering with that pattern. We could try the above and below inputs, which will set the voltage for the top of those sliders, the top range, or the bottom of them. We're getting these fast little runs back through the pattern. Let's try below. And it feels like you could be performative with patching this on the fly to interrupt your little patterns and create variations within a performance. So this to me just sounds really alive, in that we have kind of even set sliders in length mode here, but it's not perfect. It's not like a kind of digital tempo or just kind of analog step sequence. It's not a basic clock. It's that ramp, internal ramp CV going through these length settings. A near perfect timing, but not perfect timing. Just has such a great kind of human feel to it. What's exciting about the patch though is this transposition. If I remove it, this is the top sequence here, coming out into the scope is the blue trace there, and this is modulating the harmonics on the harmonic shift oscillator. Now, sequencers for tonal modulation, I'll take a ton of that any day, but having the Y inputs here, I wondered what happened if we patched audio in. Thinking of it almost like a mix input rather than a transpose input, because transposing one voltage with another is just mixing anyway. So here's a burst of audio. It's an oscillator coming through a filter. If I just open the filter up, that just mixes through. And I'm using the expander here, setting one of the gates to the C output at the end, and that opens my filter. We could just have a little bit of this. But backing the filtering off, and then using these sequences on the expander, again with output C here. This opens up my filter, comes into the transpose, and mixes in just on that last step. We could activate more steps. And I have a keyboard plugged in here so I can transpose both the modulator and the keyboard. Having such a cool kind of modulation pattern. step sequence, the tonal harmonic shift, with that little burst of audio. So here I'm using Discrete Map to drive pitch changes, again through a quantiser for my oscillator, but I'm also using the switch here on the expander where you have a common, which is an in or an out depending on how you patch it, and if that's an input, this is three outputs, A, B and C, or if A, B and C are your inputs, the common there is your output. So I'm using this to switch between three different LFOs and then take that switched LFO between the three of them to modulate my filter. And if I just keep all of these set to A on those switches, you can see the gate outs here to indicate where this is routing. Each stage is always landing on the A output there. We could do B, say for the first four. Let's say do two C's at the end, C in the middle, back to A. And it's just a simple example again, but it's really powerful, starting to connect voltage, be that for pitch or modulation changes, with routing changes on the switch. So one of my favourite things with the Discrete Map is that you can simply kick it into fast mode, and it makes for a graphic, pulse drawing oscillator. Let's make this loop and go to fast. I'm in length mode with even timing per step or even length of overall timing per step. Green trace there is the wave that I've drawn, blue trace is the pulse just for reference. We can get in there and start drawing pulses. But also if you watch this highest peak in the wave, see that on the scope. We can almost PWM individual pulses, how long individual stages are active. Get in there, turning stages on and off. Volt per octave is still volt per octave tracking. Sync becomes like a hard sync. So if I patch across from the harmonic shift oscillator here, it's just a sine. And say pitch up a bit. Sync tones as well. Rate becomes like an FM. And there's more extreme FM on the volt per octave. It's just an absolute playground for audio work. So there's a load of audio patches coming with this as an oscillator. Let's first get into one as a sync oscillator though, where we play different musical patterns off of the Discrete Map and something else that's syncing it. So here I'm using another oscillator, it's the blue trace here, it's the square wave that I'm patching across to sync. We're also listening to its triangle in the mix, and I'm running the output here through inertia. This works really well. Really well as a synced pair of oscillators. So muting the Discrete Map through inertia, this is the triangle wave from the kind of syncing oscillator if you like. It's the square wave that's patched into the sync, but the triangle out is what we're listening to in the mix. It's just playing a simple 16-step kind of root note bass line, if you like. Removing it and muting it in the mix. This is the output of Discrete Map playing a 3-note arpeggio. Now patching this in to sync again, although we're not going to listen to this, it's currently muted. What's quite interesting, if the rate's low enough, you can see we're only going through so many stages. You can hear that tone change on different notes, which I find quite fascinating. And that's because it's been synced. The rate of this is too high or too fast, so it's not going all the way to the end before it's resetting. We're just going up higher. And then patching this through a filter. Works really well. I always find hard sync quite fascinating, so definitely give it an explore here. So this is just some utterly crazy PWM. Really loving it, as you can probably tell. Let me just play around for a second and then we'll strip it back. So that's the sound out of the Discrete Map as it was set, no effects, no drums. It's massive. But stripping things back a bit further here, let me pull a couple of cables. Now we start with the ramp out, green trace on data there, no volt per octave, and the rate CV is currently down, so it's just a simple ramp. Now I'm drawing my waveforms here and playing with the length of the pulses and the kind of steps in the wave that this creates. And in doing so, there's such a good PWM sound. And I thought, well, I'll start filtering this stepped wave, which is what we have here. It's the yellow trace. And there's some great sounds in there, but going back to the direct output, if I start to use LFOs to modulate above and below, and even just modulating above, this is a triangle LFO that's attenuated and offset slightly. Let's send another free running LFO to below. Really interesting, full-on PWM. If I add a slight faster LFO here to the rate CV for a bit of vibrato, and then add a volt per octave signal to the volt per octave in. It's a huge sound. Going back to it in inertia, just filtering it. Let's add an envelope to what's effectively the cutoff of the filter. Some LFO to the skew. And then have some delay, which is coming from the second out, and some drums. So here I wanted to see if I could use the expander to create some sub-oscillators, or at least different kind of blends and mixes of pulse shapes, and we've succeeded. Let me strip this back and I'll show you what's happening. So this sound unmuted here in the mixer, the green trace is the pulse output here. Set this to be a bipolar 10 volt range, so -5 to +5. I've drawn a pulse wave, and there it is, like you've already seen. I've then used the B output on the expander here to use the switches, the first 4 set to B and the next 4 set not to be B, they could be A or C, it doesn't matter, and that gives us a sub. So blending these together, you can hear that weight that having a sub adds. And then I thought, well, we have these other outs, A and C on the expander, and these are the direct gate outputs here. So they go from 0 to 5 volts. They're unipolar, but doesn't matter, we can use them for audio too. And I thought I'd use C as well, which is the yellow trace here. And we could use A, which is coming into the scope there, red cable and trace, but I'm not using it in this particular patch. So having my main wave, a sub, and then another pulsey wave. What's quite interesting is gate length now becomes pulse width modulation for these gate outs. So if we just listen to the sub, not only does it adjust the pulse width, because it's individually modulating the gate lengths, the pulses on each step, we go from one kind of chunky wave up to like 4 separate pulses rather than one. Much higher frequency, almost like hard sync type sound. That will translate to C as well. But it's just like 2 small little thin triggers. I'll stop doing that, but I think it sounds great. So then articulating these with different rhythms, creating 3 different layers. The main layer here, the green trace, the actual discrete map output, is coming into inertia with an envelope, using it like a filter. C, the yellow trace, is coming into a passive low pass gate, and that just struck by a kind of steady 16th note clock rather than the rhythmic articulation of inertia on the main wave. And then the sub is going into a resonant filter with a less dense rhythm. And it's panned in stereo, so you've got this kind of resonant sub hits on the left. Added just kind of ticking 16th note on the right. Add the volt proctive back in. It's rhythmically interesting, it's in stereo. We've got that sub on output B, got the extra wave on C, thick stereo, all in sync. We're not using separate oscillators, it's all derived from the discrete map. I think it's a really interesting way to work, pulling more out of what you could kind of see as a single oscillator. I love the sound of this. Now, as we can address the discrete map with an external voltage, and it's voltages that span across the position or length that we set here, I thought if it's an audio voltage, but it's one whose level is changing, could we kind of span out from a central position? And that's exactly what's happening here. You can see it happening on these LEDs. And I simply have a sine wave from another oscillator, the green trace there, it's going into a VCA with a cycling envelope modulating the level. That's the blue trace, and it's this clipped sine. I'm choosing the VCA in the filter here. It's this sound that comes into the input to drive the discrete map. Due to its changes in level, you get this kind of spanning and contracting. So I also had some threshold modulation from some LFOs, giving a more buzzy, ripping, kind of electricity-like sound. But I have the level of the sine wave the VCA that's controlling it, the level is controlled by this utility. So as I turn up this sine wave, you'll see we start to address more steps. From 5 to 6. And you can hear that and see we go kind of across the discrete map there. So by modulating that with an envelope, let's take this sine an octave lower again. It's almost like the level driving the sequencer creates an overall note like a VCA. But it does so by addressing an increasing amount of steps. Such a great aggressive, electric, tearing sound. So here I'm using the Discrete Map as a bit crushing audio destruction machine. Here's my dry beat. A swung kind of 808 hip-hop groove. And that's coming into the X input here, and I've set the Discrete Map exactly as it states in the manual, which is well worth a read. First 4 stages set to rise, bottom 4 set to fall. And you can play around with either position or length mode for different results here. And you could go in and change these. Mangling your audio like a bit crusher. But I found a couple of other ways that you can get more out of this. First wondering what the gate output does, which is this sound. Which is really just almost like digital garbage, destructive junk. And then what if we kind of carve into the gate stream and how they're split on the expander. So let's take the A out. B. C. And because those switches are setting the stages to the different A, B and C outs there, we get some interesting effects. Now we could use a switch instead, so coming out of the common output here, let's patch a copy of the dry drum sound into, say, A. And this is just switching as per the switches. If they were all set to A, this switch would always route what is now the A input, i.e. the beat, because that carving in and you could patch in some high gate outs, say the B there, into the B input. It's quite an interesting bit crushed effect. Again, with the dry beat, the gates will still have an effect. Oh, that's nice. So if you like bit crushing and mangling your sounds, try the main out, the gate outs, the expander outs, and have some fun sending audio through the X input here. So while crushing beats is really fun, why should they have all the fun? Here's crushing a synth line, and this is actually the ramp out of the Discrete Map here, volt octave tracked through inertia, acting as a filter, modulated by an envelope, and you're listening to it dry. Now that's coming into the X input here too, so if I mute the dry and unmute X, this is the main output, crushed as per those settings in the last example. That's pan slightly left in the mix, now slightly right is the gate output, orange cable here. So I've got a stereo crush with the main out and the gate out. Top of that dry mix of the synth. It's anything but subtle, And this whole mix or these outputs could be passed through over filters or VCAs and articulated as new sound sources, not just as this destructive end result as I'm showing it here. If you've got this far in the video, drop a time sync in the comments. And good on you for your interest in devices like the Discrete Map. Head to patreon.com/DivKid, where you'll find an extended effects layering and stereo imaging based patch video that's based on one of the patches in this video, as well as lots of other good exclusive stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.